Welcome back to the Church Renewal podcast. I'm your host, Alan Edwards, Director of Operations at Flourish Coaching. We're dropping this bonus episode into your feed this week in a series we like to call Renewal Voices. The Renewal Voices series is all about featuring the voices of pastors, ministry leaders, denominational leaders, authors who are interested and invested in the ways that Jesus is bringing about renewal and revitalization to his church. We'd love to hear your voice as well, so please reach out to us on the web at flourishcoaching.org or find us on Facebook or Twitter, Flourish Coaching or Flourish Coach, the number 1 in those places. You can always get us directly. I'm Alan, A-L-L-A-N, at flourishcoaching.org. All right, we're happy to feature our guest today, and so come with us, listen in, and let's dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church. So Ted, first we want to take a moment and just welcome you to the Flourish Coaching podcast, the Church Renewal podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fun to have people on here to talk about their experiences and the things they've seen in the health and life of our churches. For our listeners who don't know you, can you kind of give your 3 or 4 bullet resume? Who is Ted Powers?
You bet. Well, I've been ordained in the PCA for a number of years and primarily involved in church planting over that time, particularly in the Chicago area. Wore the hat of Midwest Regional Coordinator for 23 years, then wore the hat of Church Planting Coordinator for M&A, Mission to North America, for 17 and a half years. And now I've just recently transitioned from that and taken up the mantle of Director of the Midwest Alliance, which focuses on the Midwest region of the PCA for church planting.
Okay, great. So the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, and you said you worked with M&A, which is Mission to North America. That's their home missions church planting arm.
Right.
What is the PCA's kind of ethos of church planting? Is it a church planting powerhouse? Is it a big focus of the PCA? What's the PCA's mark in the church planting world?
It's been a priority for a number of years for church planting. And over the last, it's probably 18, 20 years, we've seen on average 50 new churches being started in the PCA all across North America in a variety of different contexts. So I understand that per capita, the PCA plants more churches than anybody else.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. And so what was your role when you were working with the national arm of the PCA? Did you have like a specific portfolio of responsibilities and what was your part on that team?
Yeah, well, basically as coordinator of for church planting, I worked with the leadership in the PCA, that is presbyteries, churches that were planting churches, regional leadership, that kind of thing, to try to provide whatever resourcing I could to help them find church planters, assess them, coach them, train them, fundraise for them, the whole thing, so that presbyteries and churches were equipped to plant those churches in a healthy way.
You've seen churches engaged in church planting, right? Mothering and daughtering churches or sending people off. How does it affect the established church to be part of planting a new church?
Well, in most cases, it's a very, very positive, invigorating experience for the mother church, because what it allows them to do, especially if they're already missions minded, is to be actually personally, directly engaged in the work of the mission. So in other words, instead of just sending money or getting prayer letters and providing support through prayer, this sort of thing, all of which, of course, is fabulous, now they're actually hands-on engaged in the mission of the church. And people, even if they're not going to be part of the church plant per se, churches can be involved in prayer walking, handing out flyers. They can provide teams to man the nursery for a new church plant. They can man teams to do setup and takedown. They can do just any number of different things. And of course, with all of this, they usually are sending out a number of people. And there's a sacrifice of relationships, manpower, leadership, resources, all of that for any time that a church plants a daughter church. But for the most part, people find that extremely invigorating to have that hands-on experience in missions.
I can imagine that being a hard sell to a church. Hey, we're going to take some energy. We're going to take some people. Don't worry, you'll be fine. I can imagine people hearing you say that and saying, yeah, sure it is. But like, this has been your experience. You've seen it be a life-giving, energizing thing for the mother church to be part of this.
Yeah, yeah, you really have. And the bottom line is, it is an effort and it is a sacrifice. Here, it doesn't happen easily, and it isn't always successful. I would say probably 9 times out of 10 it's successful, but it isn't always successful. And so it really is a sacrifice in many, many ways by many different kinds of people, particularly the leadership of the church. And they just simply have to operate out of the biblical conviction that this is what God wants them to do, and therefore that it's worth it for lost people to come to know Jesus and find life in Him.
Sure. So we want to talk today a little bit about the nexus between church planting and church renewal. And here on the Church Renewal podcast, we talk about renewal and revitalization in two slightly different ways. So let me sketch those out for you and then have you interact with those ideas as they cross over church planting. So when we talk about church revitalization, we're talking about a church that is facing kind of acute or significant viability questions. They have maybe a 10 to 15 year window, and if nothing changes based on the rate that people are either passing away or moving out of the area based on their finances, they are really facing the edge of a cliff. So that's what we kind of talk about when we say revitalization. When we talk about church renewal, we talk about we need to say like the ongoing process of renewing and refreshing your hope in the gospel, getting some clarity about what you should be doing, getting unstuck. We say that some churches need to be revitalized, but all churches need to be thinking about being renewed and refreshed in the gospel mission.
Right.
So in your experience, when does a church plant start thinking about renewal and building renewal into their life as a church? When should that be happening? When do you see it happening?
Yeah, well, it varies, of course, in any given situation. What typically happens is over the first, let's say, 3 to 5 years of a church, it is so focused on networking, gathering, seeing new people come on board, reaching out to the community, having a real outward focus. And that's pretty typical for a church plant. Just the way that they have to operate that way in order to be successful. But over a period of time, there's a natural gravitational pull to the church to become more inwardly focused. And that's very understandable because there's all sorts of pastoral needs. The shepherding and care and discipling of the people that you've got. There's often intense counseling needs that go with it. You're trying also to get more infrastructure developed for the local church. Sometimes that means facility issues. Sometimes it can mean staffing issues. Now, sometimes the natural momentum of the church can continue to grow and cause new people to come in. But what we have found is that starting probably at the 5-year mark, churches need to become much more cognizant of renewal dynamics. And oftentimes, at least by year 7, they really need to. And hopefully what we've tried to do is identify earlier on that one of the ways to keep that church healthy and growing at whatever rate, real small growth or fast growth, but either way, is to keep them missionally engaged with their community, outwardly focused, so that part of their developing of infrastructure or discipling their people involves ongoing mission of the church. So our definition of a successful church plant is pretty simple. It's a worshiping community of growing disciples who are engaged in mission. Too often, people will stop after the second one, growing disciples. And our posture is that you really aren't making biblical disciples if they're not in some fashion or form engaged in the mission of the church as well.
Yeah. So churches that are feeling kind of a general stuckness or even a more acute sense of, wow, we need to turn this thing around or it's not going to be here in 10 years. What can churches, either in the general sense or in that acute revitalization sense, what can they learn from church plants and church planters?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is that you have to keep going back and asking the most basic questions to even why you plant in the first place, which is, why are we here? Why do we even exist here? Why does Jesus care that this church is here in this community? And you have to answer those most fundamental questions in a biblical way. And if you say, well, we are ultimately here to just nurture and care for the people we have, well, then I'm not sure you're going to be able to fulfill the biblical mandate of the total reason why you exist, and your years are probably numbered. And
Yeah.
so the biggest difference with churches that do continue to flourish versus those that stagnate and decline, I think, is whether they're able to maintain that missional focus, that they are there to be light and salt in their community, that they are there to reach the lost with the gospel. And so much of what they do is not only to love and care for one another and to hear the preaching of God's word and do the ordinary means of grace. That's true. But are you also engaged with your community? And then with that, are you understanding and connecting with your community? Sometimes churches are just cultural islands within their own particular neighborhood or their community because they have people coming in from outside and all over the place. They are not engaged at all in a meaningful way with the culture of their neighborhood, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's ethnic, generational, whatever it might be. So I think a big part of that is what Jesus says: lift up your eyes and see that the fields around you are ripe for the harvest. Well, that's where you got to start. You have to
Yeah.
start by looking at your mission field. Do you really even understand who it is that God has placed you in the midst of? You really need to begin to pray passionately for those people, for your neighborhood, and for God to give you wisdom and guidance as to how best to make connections. And then you have to get out of your four walls and make relational connections in the community. Just start get to
Hmm.
know people, ask them lots of questions about their lives, this sort of thing, get to know them, and then begin to strategize about the most effective way to engage them meaningfully with the gospel.
Yeah.
And that's really just a missionary approach, whether you're talking about overseas or whether you're talking about here in the States. And that's pretty much what I think is critical, that a church really has to think those things or they will slide into stagnancy and ingrownness.
Yeah. So it sounds like that thing that comes natural to a church planter. I'm going to a place where there is no church, so I have to think this way.
Right.
Just doesn't always feel natural and organic to folks that are in an existing church, whether it's a big and complex church or a small, simple parish kind of church. It just doesn't come naturally once you have a building and a bulletin and everyone's in Bible study
So true.
to be thinking, oh, what does it mean for us to be missionaries here? So maybe that's something that our renewal churches and our pastors that are trying to lead change in their churches can really learn from planters. What would it be like if we didn't have all the established stuff and we had to reimagine ourselves as missionaries to this community? Um,
That's
so,
put very well. Yeah.
well, that's what I do, Ted. Is I take big ideas and make them really simple for people like me.
Very, very good. That was well put.
Let me ask you this: I've been in and around the Reformed and evangelical community for a while, and there's a lot of talk about the particular characteristics that are helpful to have in a church planting pastor. Um, and I've heard it said that some guys can plant, but they would have a hard time leading an established church. I've heard other guys say, "Oh, I can never plant; I could only lead an established church." What's the overlap, whether it's in gifts and skills, whether it's in personality traits or characteristics? What's the overlap between the kind of person that can go out and plant a church and the kind of person that can come into an established church and begin to lead some change in that church?
Well, that's a difficult question to really answer in any kind of categorical way, for sure. I mean, if you look at the spectrum, church planter versus pastor, when we think about church planters, they tend to have more of an entrepreneurial spirit. They tend to have more of a pioneering mindset. They tend to have really sort of a catalytic bent to them. We're someone who just gets things done, makes things happen. kind of thing, all in the context of prayer, dependence upon God and the Holy Spirit for all of that. They tend to be those who are good relational skills. They like meeting new people. They like making those kind of connections and getting to know folks that way. They tend to be effective communicators, both of God's word, of vision, of values, all those different kinds of things. And so, if you're all the way down at one end of the spectrum here, a classic church planter would have those things in spades, but not everybody does. So at the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are more shepherds, who really invested in the spiritual welfare, the growth of the sheep. There could be counseling and ministry management, teaching skills, discipleship, all the different kinds of things for the long-term care of the sheep. For someone who is a renewal pastor, I think they have to have a unique blend of all of that. They have to kind of fall a little bit more in the middle. On the one hand, they do need to be, I think, very strong leadership in the sense that they have a clear vision of what the church is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
They really get to know their flock. They understand the community that is around them, and then they have the patience, which is more than most classic planters do. They have the patience for incremental change and to begin to help people over a period of time grasp these critical dynamics. And that, yes, for the sake of the gospel, we have to make some changes, but we need to do them incrementally. We need to move in this direction. And so I think a renewal pastor has more of that long-term vision, is able to move more slowly, has a lot more patience with people, and yet is a strong enough leader that he keeps the big picture before everybody.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like a little bit of the restlessness and vision of a church planter mixed with some of the patience and long-term view of an established church pastor. That kind of mix between those sounds like a good nexus.
Good summary.
Yeah, we've been using the Berkman, which is kind of like a personality and work style assessment to suss out certain characteristics, and restlessness for a pastor that's going to lead change is the pastors that are going to lead change tend to need a higher degree of restlessness than pastors that can kind of keep the status quo. And I imagine for planters, you're looking for guys that are a little restless. They have that sense of something has to be happening to really make this thing go.
Right. And if somebody doesn't have that restlessness, it's really going to be hard for them to move beyond the status quo because they're almost by definition satisfied with it. They're afraid of change. They don't want challenge. They're very nervous about failing, that kind of thing. And sometimes it's a personality thing. People who really care about things being defined and controlled and manageable and predictable. That's very hard for a person in that personality to get beyond those things that way versus the visionary entrepreneur dreamer type of individual. But in order to be a renewal pastor, I think you really do have to have that blend
Sure.
of both of those, neither one in extreme, but a blend of both of those present.
Yeah. I like the way that you said that there's like this spectrum. When we think about pastoral gifting and kind of that spectrum, I know one of the challenges that happens in church planting is transitioning from a founding pastor or a planting pastor to your second pastor. And we often say that churches are really often ripe for renewing their vision, renewing their ministry, refreshing their sense of the gospel call to a community when they're in that transition point. That transition is a great place for a church to hit the pause button and say, who are we? Why are we here? Those very questions you were asking. What are you seeing as you see, you've been working with planters across the country for your career and your ministry. What are you seeing when you see planting pastors transitioning to second pastors? What works well? What are some of the challenges that you see emerge?
Right. Well, that is a big challenge. And that is something that we have been very concerned about for a number of years because we've seen over and over churches not transition well from the founding pastor to the second pastor there. And I think it's because the founding church and the founding is taken on the characteristic of its founding pastor. Everybody who's a part of a brand new church links up and becomes part of that church because they really like the pastor.
Mm-hmm.
They have a choice at that point. They're not a part of the church. Now they can choose to be a part of the church. And they do that a lot because of the pastor's personality, his preaching, whether they form a relationship with him or not, something related to him as the pastor. When a new pastor comes on board in an established church or the second guy in a church plant, that way, all those dynamics change. Now it's the member who is there and the pastor who is the new guy on the turf. And now the adjustments, the transitions are completely different. Well, a lot of people, especially if this has been their first and only church, because they became believers here and this sort of thing, they have no idea how to navigate all of that. They really don't even know what to look for very much. And the whole idea of now they have to find someone who's going to adapt to them versus them adapting to the pastor who's playing in church. So all the dynamics are different there. In addition, what we have found just anecdotally is that churches going out to look for the second guy find someone who is opposite of the founding pastor, because what they have seen is the founding pastor with all of his strengths that got things started, but they also have seen his weaknesses. Maybe he's been great at casting vision and preaching and doing outreach and evangelism, but maybe not as good at shepherding and discipling and developing infrastructure and managing the ministry, all of that. So they say, wow, we need to staff to that weakness. So they go out there and find somebody and staff more of just an ongoing shepherd type of person who will meet all of those needs. And now they find themselves stalling. They're starting to lose all of those dynamics that attracted them to the church in the first place there. And they become frustrated and discouraged that way, even as the pastor is doing exactly what he was called there by those people to do. And so they become more, because that pastor does not tend to have those more outwardly focused gifts and that stronger outwardly focused leadership, the church starts to stagnate and go maybe even backwards that way. So we have really struggled with how to make help churches facilitate a good transition, a healthy transition from the first guy to the second guy. We've seen a lot of people make mistakes. We've not seen as many success stories as we would like to see.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about one other area, because transition is definitely a place where we see in a lot of established churches, this is kind of a moment you can spin the flywheel and make a change. It sounds like in church plants, that transition is another moment where there's a big, things could really change here. If we overreact or don't react well to our founding pastor leaving. When we teach like the life cycle of a church in a workshop with Flourish, we borrow language from Ken Priddy. And maybe you're familiar with this. Churches are on incline when they have good equal opposite pressure reaching out and developing people in. Churches move to recline when that ingrownness starts to overtake the outward missional emphasis away. And churches are in decline when there's no more outreach and it's all just, it's Tom Rainer's Autopsy of a Dead Church, right? It's lots of memorial plaques and not a lot of people in the pews.
Right.
So we would say that, if you're on incline, great, be strategic to stay on incline. If you're on recline or on decline, you need something to kind of disrupt to get that emphasis of outreach and evangelism and the mission of Jesus back to the forefront. In the church planting world, do you feel like all church plants start in the same place on this incline? Or do you feel like you see churches, I've heard, I don't know if it was you or someone else, I've heard people say that there are churches that when they're planted, they start out as a renewal revitalization work from day one. Can you comment on that dynamic if you've seen it and what that looks like?
Yeah, and that is something that I have said multiple times, that sometimes we actually plant churches that from the beginning need renewal. Need revitalization, actually.
Yeah.
In that regard. And that's because sometimes with churches, especially if they might be a daughter church out of a mother church, or sometimes a large core group that's looking for someone to come on in and take them over. Very often they will plant and go on out, and the people are thinking, well, I just won't have to drive as far to get to the mother church, but I'll get the same product.
Mm-hmm.
In effect, whatever, they don't start on a real missional commitment. They really start because they want to have immediately their own worshiping community there. And of course, being a worshiping community is fabulous. But I really do believe that the fundamental calling and identity of the church here, this side of heaven, is missions. We're called to be the light to the nations. We're called to take the gospel. And if we don't have that at the core of our philosophy of ministry, then more than likely you're going to plant a church, whether with a core group or with a daughter church out of a mother church, that right from the outset needs renewal or even revitalization. So yeah, that happens more frequently than we'd like to see too.
Yeah. Well, we always like to end episodes of the podcast with resources. We joke at Flourish that we'll give you more books than you could ever possibly read. But lots of pastors, lots of ministry leaders. We have lay folks and pastoral people that listen to the podcast. They like to know, if I want to dig into this idea more, where do I go? So if you wanted to put a couple of resources in the hands of guys who are in established churches, trying to lead change, trying to lead renewal. If you wanted them to learn something from church planters, whether that resource is a conference they should go to, or a blog that they should be reading, or a book that they should read. If I'm a renewal person and I want to think about renewing my church and I want to learn something from the church planting world, where would you point me?
Yeah. Well, one would, I think, an outstanding book is a book by Michael Goheen called A Light to the Nations. And I think he does an absolutely fabulous job of helping a church body answer those fundamental questions. Why do we exist? Why are we here? And to answer those in a very thoroughly compelling biblical way. And then to say, okay, now if you answer these right, what does this look like for us? What does that, his last chapters on what does it actually look like then to implement the biblical convictions we have about the calling and identity of the people of God being in mission is so practically helpful. And that's where I would say it would also behoove you to get a coach, someone who's going to help you process all of this, to ask the kind of questions you might not be thinking about, and to help you think through the actual implementation of a missional mindset, because it's going to be so different in every single context. People really need to think through not only what the Bible has to say, but where God has located them. And therefore, what are the languages that their people speak so that they're going to be able to hear the gospel? I don't just mean verbal language. I mean verbal language that's culturally informed in so many different ways. And the better job we can do that, then more effective we're going to be in our mission in that regard. So I would start with that book, because I think what it does is lay such solid theological, biblical, historical foundations for churches to think through these things, and especially in the PCA. If we don't have that, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
We're just not going to have that at all. And then you could just go out and get a book on church planting and say, okay, these are some of that, like Ed Stetzer's book on planting biblical churches, and just say, okay, how do we begin to implement some of these dynamics ourselves? And I think some of the critical things, for example, are that you're going to free up your pastor and support him in networking with non-believers 5 to 7 hours a week. And say, we're actually going to pray for you in that regard. We're going to hold you accountable to it. We want you to come back to session meetings and tell us who the non-Christian, maybe they're people who visited our church. Maybe there's new connections you're making in the community. Maybe there's non-Christians you're following up with because of the families your children interact with at school. It can be any number of things, but we're going to hold you accountable to that. And we are going to be mobilized to really pray for our community. And then we want you to equip us to do the same things you're doing. And then we want to be able to equip our people with the same things that you're doing. And if you have a coach that's helping you do that, and you're doing it out of biblical conviction, then I think a lot of really great things can happen.
Yeah. I feel like we could pause here and record a whole nother episode on churches giving and encouraging and coming alongside their pastor as he spends 5 to 7 hours a week networking with and doing evangelism and discipleship with non-believers. Because that's such a big ask in established churches sometimes, but it's so necessary. If the pastor is moving that way, then he brings people with him, and then that changes the culture of a church. I think that's right. Really cool. So Michael Goheen, Light to the Nations, pick up a church planting book like Ed Stetzer's Planting Biblical Churches. Those are great resources. For our listeners, we'll provide links to those resources in the episode description and on the blog at flourishcoaching.org/blog. So Ted, thank you so much for joining us for recording this episode today. We really appreciate having you.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a lot of fun.
Great.
Thanks a whole lot, Alan.
Great. It's been great having you. This is the Church Renewal podcast from Flourish Coaching. You can find us online at flourishcoaching.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter, Flourish Coach 1. That's Flourish Coach and the number 1. As always, the reason we do this podcast is that there is only one fully sufficient reason that this day dawned, and that is that Jesus is still gathering a people to himself and using his church to do it. So come join the conversation. Reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you about the ways that Jesus is renewing his church.